After initiating the carb loading, they saw an increase in muscle glycogen of about 90%. And then at the 3 days, there wasn't actually any further increase in glycogen storage, despite another 2 days of eating 10 grams per kilo.
Hello and welcome back to Fuelin Sessions. I'm your host, Scott Tindall, and today I am joined once again, thankfully, by Alan McCubbin. Alan, welcome back.
Good to be back. Thanks for having me.
Mate, this is a new segment. Well, it's not really a new segment, I guess, because we covered it in a fair bit of depth last time, which I think was very well received. But what we've decided to do is keep these dives or deep dives into research to 2 papers only, and also probably not get too much into the weeds, but really just extract from these really interesting studies that we're going to present over the course of this segment, what the key takeaways were, what was studied, what do we learn, and maybe what's next from these studies. So the first study we're going to get into, well, actually there's 2 timely studies, I think, because actually both have raised their heads amongst Fuelin athletes recently, especially the first one, which we're going to talk about, which is carbohydrate load. And this was from a new athlete coming on, a female athlete who was about to do the London Marathon. And she saw that the Fuelin protocol for carbohydrate loading was 1 day before, and she sort of questioned that and said, I've always done a 3-day carbohydrate load. I've always felt good with that, so I'm going to stick with that. And we obviously had a little bit of chat over the Fuelin coaches chat with her, and we decided, actually, you know what, you've always done 3 days, so that's fine. Let's stick with that. However, there is research to say that perhaps 3 days is not required. So why don't we dive into the first paper and just why don't you tell us what the title of the paper is, and then maybe, we'll just get into it from there.
Yep. Yeah. So I think the first thing to point out is this is not a new paper. This was actually published way back in 2002, but we'll talk about why we looked at this paper in just a sec. So the title was Carbohydrate Loading in Human Muscle, an Improved 1-Day Protocol. The first author was Vanessa Bussau and colleagues at the University of Western Australia, as I said, back in 2002.
Yeah, look, it is an older study, but as you said, old studies don't always mean that they should be thrown out with the dishwater. And I think that happens all too often. People will say, oh, it's an old study, but it still holds a lot of relevance. So where do you want to start? Do you want to start with like the top 3 takeaways, or should we just start with the study overview?
Maybe we'll go for the study overview.
Yep.
And just to answer that question, why pick such an old study? Well, the reason is, as far as I can tell, there hasn't been any newer research since 2002 to look at this specific question of how many days is enough from a carb loading perspective. So even though it's, 23 years old now, it is the most recent study that's looked at this topic, as far as I can tell.
It's pretty amazing when you think about that, isn't it? And you think, okay, how hard would it be to actually implement this and replicate this and maybe do it a little bit potentially differently, or at least replicate it to show that it does work. Maybe we're throwing it out there for some researchers to get back into it. Okay, so what was the objective of the study?
Yeah, so I guess to put that in a practical context, as you said, the traditional views around carbohydrate loading have been multiple days are required of really high carb intakes to get that full, sort of glycogen stores within your muscles. If we go right back to the 60s and 70s, when the muscle biopsy needle came out and the very first studies of carbohydrate loading were done, they actually had a complete depletion phase. So people actually went on a really low carb diet and did a whole bunch of exercise for 2 or 3 days to get their glycogen stores as low as possible. And then they did 3 days of really high carb feeding to try and then increase it back up again. The idea being is if you went right down to rock bottom, you'd get a sort of a bigger rebound. That was the theory. Then in 1981, a study came out that suggested actually that whole 3-day depletion was not necessary, as long as you kind of tapered off your training, so you weren't chewing through the carbs as you were eating them, then, a 3-day protocol would be absolutely fine. And then this study came along and said, well, since 1981, we haven't really had any studies to say whether 3 days is the minimum you need, or actually you can get away with less again. And from a practical point of view, there may be situations where you want to do less, either because, all those extra calories are not required. That might be a detrimental thing in some cases. In some sports where you've got to turn around from one event to the next, you only have limited times to fit this in around training anyway, particularly something like pro cycling, for example. Less of an issue maybe for a marathon or a triathlon where you might only do 1 or 2 or 3 a year, something like that. So a bit of a different context. But I think that's essentially why they did the study.
Yep. And who was studied specifically in this?
Yeah, so the participants in this study were 8 male cyclists and triathletes. So I guess there's a couple of caveats. It is only 8 people. They are all males. They were all relatively young. I think they were between 18 and 30 off the top of my head. Average age was 23. Average weight was 77 kilos. They were training on average 11 hours a week. And they had a VO2 peak, which was usually slightly higher than VO2 max, of about 59 mils per kilo per minute. Their usual calorie intake was just over 4,000 calories a day, and their usual carb intake was just under 6 grams per kilo per day, which is important when we come to the context of what the carb loading looked like.
Yeah, look, I mean, it was a smaller study, but as you say, there hasn't been any others, so we have to use what we've got available at our fingertips. It's a shame no females, and we'll get into that a little bit where we maybe discuss the implications of this study. But okay, so what was studied specifically?
Yeah. So basically what they were looking at was how much muscle glycogen you could store within your muscles. So to figure that out, you do a muscle biopsy. As I said, that needle, that technique of quantifying glycogen within the muscle has been around since the late 60s now. So what they did basically is they got everyone to exercise in the lab so they could kind of standardize that last exercise bout 1 day prior to starting the carb loading phase. And then from the first day of the carb loading phase, they took a muscle biopsy when the person was fasted before they'd eaten their first meal of the day. And then they got them to eat 10 grams per kilo per day. So that's your carb loading quantity in this case, for 3 days. So what they did then is they had the muscle biopsy before they started the carb loading. And then after the first 24 hours, they did a second muscle biopsy. So you could see where they got to after 24 hours. And then after 72 hours, so 3 days, they did a second or a third biopsy, I should say. And so they've got the muscle glycogen content before the carb loading started, after 1 day, and then after 3 days.
Yeah, I like the way that they sort of did this because it meant, I mean, it was just sort of a rolling sort of assessment, wasn't it, of the impact of the carbohydrate load as opposed to having to do sort of over, I don't know, different days and different periods of time. They sort of just rolled it through. So I thought it was quite clever in that sense.
Yeah.
Okay, the key outcomes. What do we see as a result of this?
Yep. So at the 24-hour period after initiating the carb loading, they saw an increase in muscle glycogen of about 90%. And that kind of fits with the existing studies that had looked at this up until that point. And then at the 3 days, there wasn't actually any further increase in glycogen storage, despite another 2 days of eating 10 grams per kilo. I probably should have pointed out also they didn't do any exercise through those 3 days to ensure that wasn't then eating into those glycogen stores during that time. They also looked at the breakdown of the muscle fiber types to see whether, that's the total glycogen across all the muscle tissue that they've taken out with the biopsy. But if you break that down into individual types of muscle fibers, was there any differences there? And again, no, there wasn't any differences there either. So
the other point on that, Al, as well, is that it was uniform, wasn't it? And the efficiency over time as well. So at 24 hours, they all uniformly were saturated. It wasn't like one muscle fiber was less than the other. It all appeared that all the muscle fibers became saturated at the same rate, which I thought was really interesting as well.
Yeah.
So, because I think that's an argument sometimes, isn't it, that I've seen in the past where maybe you don't get the same saturation in muscle glycogen through fiber type specificity.
Yeah, that's right. Because
showed.
That is the potential where you say, okay, well, you might get lots in one muscle fiber type, but you need the second or the third day to fill the other muscle fiber types. But no, that wasn't the case here.
Yeah. And then I think the other point that you did say about the no exercise during that time, which again might have implications. And you discussed it earlier because that thought was like you had to become depleted. And where do you see that? Like, because some of these studies, I think where they've shown is that maybe it did take longer to become super compensated in terms of glycogen content. Do you believe that's because those participants in those previous studies were starting at a lower amount?
Yeah, that's correct. So certainly when you read the discussion in this paper, that's sort of what the authors talk about. They talk about the fact that in those earlier papers where they showed it did take a full 3 days to carb load, they were studies where they went through this depletion phase first. And so what they think is happening there is it takes the first day just to get you back to normal, like where you started before the depletion, and then you need a second and or a third day to then get those super compensations from happening. Interestingly, that 1981 paper that I mentioned, where they did away with the depletion phase, they showed a 3-day carb loading protocol again was just as effective, but they didn't actually take a biopsy at 24 hours. So it may be that that study would have also found that 1 day was just as effective. They just didn't measure it at that time, so they don't know.
Might have saved the study occurring in 2002.
Yeah, we might have been talking about a 1981 paper here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if I asked you some questions, okay, can maximal glycogen loading occur without prior glycogen depleting exercise?
It certainly seems to be. Yeah, absolutely. The caveat, I guess, there is that you're doing minimal training during that time that you're eating the carbohydrate. But yes, it does appear that that is the case from this study.
Is a full 3-day loading protocol necessary for trained athletes?
It doesn't seem to be, but again, the caveat here is that you're not doing any or very minimal training during that carb loading period. So I guess that depends on the athlete and how they like to prepare for an event. If they're doing a bit of training, some athletes like to do literally nothing the day before a race. Some people like to do a shakeout. It might only be 10 or 15 minutes, whereas some people like to go out for a full hour or something. Or you're doing an event where you've got limited time and you've got to do a bit of course recon or something the day before. So I think in those situations, probably having a longer carb load makes a bit more sense because you need to start ahead of the game before you do that bit of training. But if you're not in that situation, it seems that 1 day is adequate.
If we take that a little bit further, if you were going to exercise on the day of your carbohydrate load, would you then say be sure to take in carbohydrates during whatever exercise you're doing?
Yeah, whether it's during or after, I'm not sure whether we have enough evidence to show whether one will make more of a difference than the other, as long as the total amount would be the same. Theoretically, I think you'd get probably a similar result, but I'm not sure anyone's looked at that directly. I guess probably the moral of that story is the earlier you get that exercise session done in the day before, the longer you've got in terms of that recovery period to get the rest of those carbs in, both from a practical point of view of just how do I physically eat all those carbs, but also from the time to actually get it digested, absorbed into the muscle and stored as glycogen as well.
Yep, that makes sense. And then finally, do all muscle fiber types respond similarly to carbohydrate loading?
Well, from this study, it seems so, yeah.
Yeah. If I ask some questions that maybe it raised that, I was thinking about, were previous protocols taking longer? Yeah, as we said, do you think the previous protocols, as the authors also said, were taking longer because of that depletion? And do you believe that depletion is necessary?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly looks that way. I would suggest that depletion is probably not necessary. I think that the rationale behind it was that the slope upwards in terms of storing glycogen after depletion was better. I think over time we went from a 3-day complete depletion to just a bit of exercise to deplete a little bit to no depletion at all. And I don't think anecdotally, we're not seeing athletes going, oh, I'm so much better when I deplete first. I mean, there might be a few out there that feel that way, but I'm certainly not seeing that either. So, it probably, that message, I think, gels with what we're seeing in the real world, which is always important as well.
Yeah, I couldn't think of anything worse than doing a glycogen depleting sort of protocol on the week of race week.
You talk to the guys who used to do that back in the 80s, and they did not enjoy it at all. They used to say how they felt like death, like those. They're basically eating a keto diet for the first 3 days of race week and doing as much exercise as they could during that time. So their taper in terms of their training taper is probably not as good as it could or should have been. And they're going on this keto diet for 3 days and then completely flipping it around to go super high carb for 3 days and then tapering off the training. So, yeah, I mean, even just logistically, if you think like a lot of races these days, you do a significant travel often on the week of the race, like just superimposing that like 6 day protocol on on top of a long haul flight or something overseas, getting into unfamiliar accommodation and in a different part of the world or a different time zone when you're jet lagged and all of those sort of practical things that you've got to put into this as well. You can see how that would just be so much more difficult and as it appears unnecessary.
Completely. I note that the athletes on this study habitually were taking in, most people might say higher amounts of carbs on a daily basis, around 5 grams per kilo. Do you think that has an implication on athletes? Do you need to be taking in carbohydrates regularly in order to benefit from a carbohydrate load?
To an extent, yes, because if you're not taking, like if you're going on a keto diet, there's probably little point doing carb loading because you're not going to reverse the effects of that in terms of down regulating the ability to use carbohydrates. So you're storing all these carbohydrates that you then probably can't use that effectively anyway. We also know that the ability to store carbohydrate has a fitness element to that. So the fitter you are, probably the more carbohydrate or the more glycogen you can store relative to someone else of the same body composition, but maybe less well trained as well. So there does seem to be an element of adaptation to that. I guess the other thing is that we tend to describe, that in this case it was 10 grams per kilogram of body weight per day of carbohydrate for the carb load. Now, if you have two people that are the same body weight, so let's say 70 kilos, but one has a higher percentage body fat, by definition, they have a lower percentage of that 70 kilos that is muscle. And so, probably small differences aren't going to really make much difference in the real world. But if you've got someone who has a unusually high, body fat for an athlete or an extremely lean physique, you may see differences in the capacity to store glycogen per kilo of total body weight as well.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting. Does it make a difference in the practical sense? I don't know. I guess it depends how extreme that body composition is.
Yeah. And just to follow up, I think one of the questions that some listeners might be wondering is, obviously this was a study of male athletes, and so what happens with female athletes? There has been more review papers sort of looking at the literature more broadly in carbohydrate loading since this one was published, and they certainly note with female athletes, some of the studies found that carbohydrate loading was less effective in female athletes, but when you look at the way that those studies were designed, the carb loading wasn't done in grams per kilo, it was done as percentage of calories that came from carbs. And often this was when the female athletes had a fairly low calorie intake, so 80% of a lower calorie intake means they're actually eating less carbs anyway. Once you match the carb intake, so using grams per kilo, for example, you don't see that effect, and it seems to be just as effective for females as it is for males.
You beat me to it. I was just about to say, would these findings apply to female athletes or untrained individuals? The study you're referencing there was, is it Tarnopolsky?
I can't remember off the top of my head. It's a review paper from 2008 that sort of brought all of this together.
Yeah. And so I think that, and I was listening to Asker talk about this paper actually the other day, and he was saying it was back in 95 and they did exactly that. Yeah. It equated to 5.7 grams per kilo when they did the. No, and that's exactly right. It's not carb loading. And then when they actually bumped it up to 75% of the total energy intake, and then what they did was apply an extra 30%, that actually then bumped the girls up to 10 grams per kilo. Oh, and lo and behold, muscle glycogen content was exactly the same between males and females. So I think and that's always pulled out that study. It's like, no, carbohydrate doesn't work for women. It's like, well, it does if it's done the same way that we would recommend for men.
Yes.
And that's what I always find really interesting about that. So I think that is a really important point. What about menstrual cycle influence? Because I know that's also going to come into it. based on the research that we have, and there is limited, my understanding is that menstrual cycle phase does not impact muscle glycogen storage, again, if it is done correctly. So somewhere in that 10 to 12 grams per kilo.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well.
Yeah, and I think the paper we can reference for that is James et al. 2001. I think they did use 12 grams per kilo, but again, I think as long as you're sitting in that 10 to 12 grams based on the few studies we've got, it seems to be effective.
Yeah.
If we had to say areas for improvement for this, what would you say? Like where would you say, okay, what could be done for a future study? Given there hasn't been one of these studies in 20 odd years, what would you be saying, hey, I'd love to see this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess a couple of things. One would be to look at a broader diversity of athletes. So in this case, we only had cyclists and triathletes. So to include some pure runners in there, I think would be useful as well, just because obviously some of the glycogen storage and depletion in exclusively runners might be slightly different to exclusively cyclists or into triathletes as well, just in terms of where that carbs are sort of coming in and out as people are training regularly. And so some of that adaptation may be muscle group specific. We don't know. So that would be part of it, including female athletes. Even though we said that the differences probably appear minimal, that would make sense. I think having a broader diversity of athletes in general. So broader diversity of age, males and females, from complete beginners through to, very high level professional athletes as well. Given that we know that the highest end athletes probably have more glycogen storage capacity, maybe one day is not enough for them, because you just can't eat enough carbs in one day to actually store that away against the maximum capacity that kind of an athlete would have. And maybe in a beginner athlete, one day is in fact overkill at 10 grams per kilo. Maybe they only need 8 grams per kilo, or, and you can achieve that within half a day or something like that. So, I think there's a couple of questions that we could, tighten up on a little bit, but I think it gives us a pretty good sort of pointer in terms of where to go. And certainly, as you mentioned off the top, it certainly informs what we do in terms of the recommendations within the Fuelin app. We tend to go a bit higher 2 days before, but not to sort of full carb loading amounts, and then to your full carb load on the day before the event.
Do you think, thanks for that, Al. Do you think that a performance metric assessment should be also tied into a study like this?
As in whether the carb loading was 3 days would be better for performance compared to one?
Yeah, so if they did some sort of time to exhaustion or time trial or something like that to try and see, does 3 days make more of a difference to that performance element? I mean, obviously it's another arm to a study, but would that be interesting to see?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly possible. I guess it would open a big can of worms if there was a difference, because then we'd be saying, well, if the difference isn't the glycogen, what is it? That would lead us down a whole other rabbit hole in and of itself. Interestingly, there are also other studies looking at, okay, if you carb load today, how long does that glycogen remain at that elevated level if you don't do any training? And the answer is you can take it out to 3 or 5 days. As long as you don't train and deplete it, you can actually maintain almost all of that glycogen for up to almost 5 days. Not that there's really an advantage in doing that, but it is theoretically possible.
Well, I guess that was discussed. That was in the discussion as well, I think, that part. And I thought it was interesting because, like, let's say you are traveling somewhere and you've got to travel for 2 or 3 days and you arrive the day before or something like that, you could theoretically do your carbohydrate load before you get on the plane. If you're traveling to Australia or something like that, do your carbohydrate load beforehand. It would stay elevated.
I guess if you've got like a logistical nightmare the day before the race, then that is a possibility. Yeah.
No, very interesting. Look, we said we'd cover 2 papers. I'm actually going to say we're going to leave it at 1. And what we'll do is we'll come back for the next episode on the second paper. You good with that?
Yep.
Excellent. Okay, mate, super interesting. I guess, actually just wrapping up on this one. So I think, look, what we know based on, as you very clearly said, is a limited amount of research around carbohydrate loading. We know that it appears 1 day can be as effective as 3 days. Certainly for men, when it is done properly, at least 10 grams per kilo. Does it apply to women? Potentially, based on other research that we know if a carbohydrate load is done correctly, i.e. high amounts of carbs based on grams per kilo, that also can be effective for women regardless of where they are in their menstrual cycle. So I think for us at Fuelin, we do, as you said, apply a higher amount of carbohydrates 2 days out. We also ensure that the athlete isn't in a caloric deficit during race week, so they're on a maintenance caloric plan at least. 2 days out, around 6.5 grams per kilo, and then the day before, they're going to be somewhere between that 8 and 12 grams per kilo, again, depending on total caloric needs. So that's what we do. I think it's safe to say that athletes, when they do that, they certainly report feeling very, very good on race day. And so anecdotally, I think, again, from a field-based perspective, we're very comfortable with what the research is showing and how we're applying that in Fuelin.
Yep, absolutely. Agreed.
Cool. Okay, mate. I'll catch you for the next one.
Will
Cheers.
do. See ya.